Okay, so in this tutorial, I'm going to show an example of recursion. So a popular recursion example is the factorial method. So the factorial method, I've had this come up in multiple interviews, so I think this is going to be a good example. So I'm going to go ahead and create a class. I'm just going to call this recursion. And for this example, I'm going to go ahead and just get the input from the user. So to get the input from the user, I'm just going to go ahead and create a scanner object. And like my other videos, I'm just going to assume that everybody's a beginner. So static, it's basically just meaning that I do not need to create an instance of the scanner class to use this method or create this object. Okay, so static scanner is going to be the class that I'm going to use, which I need to import. So I'm creating a scanner object. I'm going to name it console. I'm going to pass in the system input or whatever the user enters on the console. I'm going to call the constructor for the scanner class. So create scanner object to get user input. So created my object so I can get the user from the input. Now I'm going to create my main class, public static void. So our main method, when this program runs, it's going to find the main method, and that's going to be the driver code. So all the magic's going to happen in here. If we make any methods outside the main method, they will not be called unless we call it inside of our main method. Okay. So let's create a variable called int or called fact, and then let's create do string input. Actually, no, let's do int input equals 0. So we're just going to instantiate these and set them as default values, and then we're going to prompt the user. So we need to print out on the console and prompt the user for some input. So system.out.println please enter a number to calculate factorial. So we're going to print this out on the screen, and then we're going to capture the user input and store it in the variable called input. So console.next. So console.next, that'll grab the input from the user, and it'll convert it to an integer. And then we're going to call our factorial. We're going to call our factorial method that we have not created yet, and we're going to pass in that input. And then after we pass in our input to the factorial method, it's going to return us an answer, and we're going to store that in the fact variable, and then we'll just print the results. print results, calculate factorial with user input. Okay, so our main method is set up, our driver code, but we're calling this factorial method and we have not created it yet, so let's go ahead and create that. So public, just meaning it's public to all the classes, that's okay, we don't really care. And then static, meaning we do not need to instantiate a recursion object. We do not need to create an object of this class to use the method. So public, static, and then what are we going to return? We're going to return an integer, and then it's a factorial method. That's what we called it. Open paren, close paren, end of factorial method. And our argument, or in our parameter, we're going to pass in an integer. We'll just call that num. And then this is going to be a recursive method. So kind of like in my whiteboard tutorial, we need to have a base case. So basically, if num equal to 0 is going to be our base case, then return 1. So base case. And to understand this more, I have another tutorial, but basically it's going to keep recursively calling factorial until it gets to this base case where num equals 0. So basically if we pass in 5, it's going to keep coming down here and recursively calling factorial but passing in a new value each time until that value gets to 0, and then we want to return 1. That will be our base case. So then we want to return num times recursively calling our factorial method, but we want to do num minus 1. So if let's just say this is 5. If we pass in 5 to our factorial method, that's not equal to 0, so it hasn't got to our base case yet. So then we're going to return 5. Oops. We're going to return 5 times factorial 5 minus 1, which is 4. So we're going to pass in 4. Basically, it's going to kind of put in memory, it can't do any calculations yet because we haven't got to the base case. And I explain this more in the other tutorial that I have. So, pretty easy recursive method. Let's just put recursively call method with new value. Now when we call the factorial, I just want to go over this. It's going to take off 1 because if we just kept passing in num, it's not really doing anything. So each time we go through this, almost like a loop in a sense, this number is going to change each time. So let's go through this. So if we pass in 5, 5 is not equal to 0. So then we're going to basically come back up here and we're going to pass in 5 times, or I'm sorry, we're going to do 5 times factorial 4 minus 1. So basically what this is doing, it's basically in memory, let's just say here's our factorial loop. Basically, we have our base case, so we pass in 5 into our factorial method. It basically says, hey, before we can calculate this, we need to figure out what 4 factorial is. Before we can calculate what 4 factorial is, we need to figure out what 3 factorial is. Before we can figure out 3 factorial, we need to calculate 2 factorial. So it's basically every time it's going in and it's saying, hey, let's put this in memory. We need to find out what 5 factorial is. It's getting a little sloppy, but fact. This basically, like I said, we don't know we can't figure out 5 factorial until we know what 4 factorial is. So it's going to recursively pass in num minus 1. I'm sorry, this is 5 minus 1 factorial, which is 4 factorial. I should have just wrote 4. It's going to put that on hold. It's basically, this is a stack where it says, hey, hold on for right now. I can't answer this until I figure out 4 factorial. And then it says, hey, I can't figure out what 4 factorial is until I know what 3 factorial is. Just in case you guys don't know what factorial is, because I forgot to explain that in the beginning, it's basically if we have 5 factorial, it's 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So this, when it goes through, it goes through the third time recursively, it says, hey, I can't figure out what 3 factorial is until I figure out what 2 factorial is. So I'm going to put that on hold. And then it's going to get to 1 factorial, and it's going to say, hey, I can't figure that out until I figure out what 0 factorial is. That's when it gets to the base case, when n equals 0. And it says, hey, I do know what 0 factorial is 0. So then it gives the method 0, and then it can go back up and calculate 1 factorial, then it can go back up and calculate 2 factorial because we know what 1 factorial is. Now we can go back up and calculate 3 factorial because we know what 2 factorial is, and we can go all the way back up and answer all these questions because we know what all these factorials are. We couldn't calculate them before because we had to get to the base case. Okay, so let's see here. Let's go ahead and run this method. Let me just make sure in fact equals 1. Okay, so let's run this and see if this works properly. So let's do a Control S and save it, and then let's run. Let's go ahead and do right click and then run as Java application. It's going to print to our console and ask us enter a number. Let's enter 5. Oops, I probably did something silly here. Oh, so print results. I didn't actually print anything. So print, let's just do results. And the result is going to be stored in that fact variable once we actually call the method and pass in the input. So let's run this again. Let me save this. Run it again. Please enter a number to calculate. Let's enter 5. 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So 5 times 4 is going to equal 20. 20 times 3 is going to equal 60. 60 times 2 is going to equal 120. 120 times 1 is going to equal 120. So let's go ahead and pass it in one more. Let's run the method again just to make sure this works. Please enter a number to calculate. Let's do 25. Okay, and let's just check that, see if that's right. There's got to be a calculator online. So let's see if we can find something to double check that real quick. Factorial calculator. And let's type in, I don't know how this works, but 25. There we go. So 25. Calculate. Of course, that's not going to display what we want, so let's calculate 8. 8 is 403.20. Eight, 403.20. Awesome. Okay, so again, we created a class for recursion. We created a scanner object using the scanner class in the util package. So that object allowed us to grab input from the user. We created a couple variables here just for temporary use. Print out to the screen. To prompt the user for the input, we grabbed that input using the next integer method from the integer class, and we threw that in the input. And then we called our factorial method and passed in our input that we got from the user and stored that in fact, and then we printed that result. And our factorial method passes in a number. If it's not the base case, then it puts it on hold, and basically this basically says, hey, let's find out all the factorials I need to get, I need to calculate, and then it keeps doing that until it gets to the base case. When it gets to the base case, like I said, then it can go back up and calculate all the other ones. So that's recursion, guys. Hope you liked the video.
Thanks for watching, guys. Give it a like, subscribe to the channel.